Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today. I've got my Svartpilen 401 here. I have just tested in Spain the new 2024 Svartpilen 401 and I thought I'd talk about where the old bike is clearly lacking in comparison to the new bike. Now it's important to remember that obviously new bike, we expect some updates. The new bike is 90% new, which is huge. And I would go as far as to say Husqvarna have essentially redesigned the entire machine and improved it in almost every way possible that I can think of. There are a couple of things that are retained, like basically the seat design, which is quite a comfortable seat, way better than a lot of the other seats in the class, despite being quite minimalistic. They have kept the wheels and the tires, and very importantly, these are not tubeless tires. A couple of people brought that up in one of my previous videos. I thought I saw something which suggested they might be on the new model. However, I double checked with Husqvarna. They are not a tubeless tire. We're still getting the old tubed spoked wheels, which is not surprising because these are still built to a price. There is a small price increase. They're going to be $8,750 on road right away. So a little bit of a jump up. I think they're about $8,300 previously for the 23 model. And as a result of that, you are paying a little bit more. But let's talk about why you're paying a little bit more, because I'm going to be honest, if I were given the choice of saving $1,000, maybe even $1,500 and buying a 23 model or waiting a couple of months, the 24s will be here in July, I would definitely, unless money was the primary concern, the biggest concern, spending as little as possible, I'd be waiting for a 2024. It's a significantly better bike. Why is it a better bike? Let's go over the features one by one and I'll give you a very, very quick rundown as to the improvements and why I think they're better. Okay, engine improvements are a funny one these days. We've got the Euro 5 and now 5 Plus emissions, which a lot of manufacturers are scrambling to keep up with, and as a result we're seeing capacities rise, performance normally getting a little bit better, but not enormously changing, despite in some cases a much bigger kind of capacity increase. And I would probably say the big advantage of the 2024 Svartpilen 401 is the simple fact that the engine is more refined. Now, what do I mean by more refined? It's smoother. This is quite a frenetic single cylinder. As the revs rise, you do start to get some vibes through those bars, and it's never been a bike that I would say was really great for cruising on the freeway at say 110, 120, 130, simply because the engine is just so active and you can really feel it quite mechanically doing its thing, and it's just not the smoothest. The new engine, it's been bumped up to a 399cc, but where I really noticed the difference was actually just the simple fact it is so smooth all the way basically up to where the power falls off and you're essentially over-revving it. It is just a much, much nicer engine from a quality of life perspective. And I'd also say the fueling and maybe even the engine braking felt a little bit nicer. Slightly gentler engine braking, and onto the slipper clutch is a little bit smoother. And overall, that new engine is an absolute gem. And obviously that's shared with the new 390s, which get the 399cc version. This is the 373cc version. And I've really got to congratulate KTM and Husqvarna for basically remaking that engine and just improving it in every way. They've kind of bridged a lot of the gap from the smoothness perspective with a lot of the parallel twins. I'd say one of the weaknesses of most of these single cylinder engines is the simple fact that because they're like super revvy and they do get vibey and stuff like that, the parallel twins kind of draw ahead in some circumstances, particularly like cruising the freeway, where the new version, to me, so much better, so much better. And you can't kind of understate that as far as like a quality of life difference. If you're buying your first motorcycle and you buy one of these, I don't think you'll be disappointed. However, buying the 2024 model, it is a much better bike. And I came back to Australia thinking to myself, am I going to jump on my 21 model and be like really disappointed by just how it doesn't have all those improvements? And I'd say number one, no. I've had a lot of fun riding my bike this morning. However, having ridden something which is essentially the same but better, I am now kind of looking at this bike going, oh yeah, I really appreciate those differences. But let's move on to the next area. Okay, Next big point is the brakes, and this is kind of an interesting one as well. They've actually, on the new model, moved the disc brake to this side of the wheel, which from a styling perspective is going to mean that the bike just looks better because the brake isn't hidden away on the wrong side of the wheel essentially. So a little bit of a styling exercise there. The big thing for me with the brakes is that these brakes here, I would say the bite is a little bit harsh for probably, I would say, not only for a beginner-centric bike where you're going to have less experienced riders, but also for me, with this being a fairly agile, very nimble, almost flighty machine, and having some quite beefy forks on them. I find on this bike, and I found it particularly today after having ridden the other bike, it's the transitions on and off the brakes, trailing them into the corner. This is quite harsh. And on the new bike, I think because it doesn't have quite the initial bite and it's got better modulation on the brakes, they're just a little bit softer in the application, but all the power is still there. That brake system is much, much more usable, not only for a newer rider who I think is going to appreciate that, but also for an experienced rider who, going from the old bike or going back to the old bike, was looking at those brakes going, wow, I should almost put like some softer pads in or something like that to bring them a little bit closer to the 2024 model so that I can use them a little bit more aggressively and just be a little bit more active on the brakes, because certainly trail braking into the corners is going to help your cornering, and yeah, it's just better. And I don't really do it on this bike, and today reminded me why, because it's not as good. It's not on some bikes, it comes very, very naturally and everything just works. On this bike, I would say those brakes being, yeah, a little bit rough on and off has meant that I've really avoided doing it, and I can generally get away with doing it because it's a pretty good handler. Now, a little bit more broadly on the chassis side of things compared to just the brakes that I was just talking about, we've seen a massive overhaul on the new Svartpilen 401. It's got a new frame, it's got a new swing arm. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe the swing arm's a little bit longer. They reckon the wheelbase is only 10 mils longer, but the stability is significantly better, particularly at high speeds. If you're cruising on the freeway, as the speeds pick up on this older model, you do feel in those bars that because it's just such an agile machine, that little bit of flightiness does come into it. On the 2024 model, doing 150 Ks, it was nice and stable. You're starting to feel the fact that it is still quite an agile handler, but it goes a lot further and goes a lot faster before you start to notice that. Huge improvement. And I would also say, as far as the overall riding, the kind of stability on the side of the tire through the corners, getting onto those brakes, everything like that is just significantly better on the new model. And it kind of has me wondering what I could do on this bike to try and improve it a little bit, to bridge that gap. And I think the next thing I'll do is have a look at that shock and see whether I can adjust up that a little bit. However, this being a slightly shorter wheelbase and, as I said, a little bit of a flightier machine, you're always going to probably have that problem in comparison to the new chassis, which has been totally redesigned to basically improve the bike in that area quite significantly. And certainly on the more general handling side of things, even though Husqvarna told us the ergos were kept quite similar between the new and the old Svartpilen 401, I did actually find myself noticing that the new bike is just a little bit of an easier handler into the corners. While this thing turns really, really fast, for whatever reason, I did find that kind of that new chassis setup, which I think there is some slight geometry changes compared to the outgoing models as part of obviously that revamp, did just make it a nicer handler overall. And I know people say, well, nice is kind of a meaningless metric, but I would say it's an overall better handler on the new bike, a little bit more balanced, I guess is a good way of putting it. And while I'm going to really have a go with the adjustability of the suspension and see whether I can get this bike a little bit closer to the handling, I will be surprised if that's the case. On the suspension side of things, what they have done, which is really cool from my perspective, because I do like the beginner-centric bikes, is they've revised the suspension adjustability to reduce how many clicks of adjustment you got. So I think these have got 30 clicks on the front and 25 on the rear as far as rebound, and then you've obviously got your preload collar. However, they've simplified it to 5 on the front and I think 5 on the rear on the new model. So for a new rider, you're able to adjust the bike a lot more quickly, a lot more easily. You're going to see those changes a little bit more noticeable. They did say the adjustability is kind of the same range as on the current bike. It's just you're doing more adjustment per click, and it's a 360 degree kind of adjustment with 5 points. So really simple. The probably standout on the new model is that rear shock, which is no longer kind of hidden in the middle. It's offset on the side of the bike here, so it looks a little bit cooler. I feel like the new shock's a little bit more beefy, but I think that's just because it's so obviously displayed on the side of the bike. And on the Svartpilen particularly, I found that shock significantly better. On this bike, going over speed bumps, it is quite harsh. And again, because it's a short wheelbase kind of machine and a little bit twitchy, you do want to be a little bit careful taking speed bumps at speed, whether those really little small car park speed bumps or the bigger ones. And on the new machine, it handled that stuff so well that I was left kind of wondering what was wrong with my bike. And jumping back on this machine, the 2021 model, going over all the speed bumps, getting out of the apartment block today, I was again kind of thinking, wow, that new bike, the shock was just so much more sorted. I'm gonna have a play around with the adjustability on this bike and see whether I can bring it a little bit closer. However, that new shock was absolutely exceptional. But at the end of the day, the chassis and the suspension setup on the new model was a big step up, I feel, compared to this bike. And I feel like it's probably mainly on the chassis side of things with how they've kind of tweaked the geometry and everything like that for that extra stability, because that was certainly very noticeable on the side of the tire and everything. But the ride comfort was significantly better too, which, you know, is pretty big. Talking of comfort, the seat on this is 835 mils. They've dropped the new seat to 820, and while it's not a huge difference, I think if you're on the shorter side of things, you're going to appreciate that shorter seat height. It's going to make it a little bit more accessible for riders. They've also, as far as I can tell, boosted the ground clearance a little bit because of the way they've routed the exhaust on the new models. 180 mils of ground clearance, which is quite generous for particularly a road bike, and that's going to help if you're kind of driving or riding off curbs or doing a little bit of off-roading stuff. But yeah, it's a kind of cool small change. And obviously the lower the seat height, the better for getting people onto your bike. But 820 mils is still, I would say, on the taller end of things for a naked bike, where we're looking at competition, which is at 785, 800 mils, that kind of area. And these are still taller. But again, kind of talking about the feel of the bike, the new 401, it feels like a larger bike, where this machine feels very short and very tall. The new bike feels more like a regular length motorcycle. It feels like it's got a bit more presence to it, got that bigger bike feel, and also that seat is a little bit lower. And I will even say I felt like the comfort was a little bit better on the new machine. Don't know why, because I've always really felt the seat on this one was quite good, but certainly kind of grasping the tank and where there's those lines in the bodywork, new bike was significantly better. So yeah, that's an interesting one. The one area, and I will point this out while we're kind of in this area, don't mind where I've scratched up the exhaust. The one area that I really prefer on this bike is the exhaust. The underbelly exhaust does keep the weight centralization nice and low. It's tucked away, all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, I prefer the look of a proper exhaust. I'm not a huge fan of those underbelly exhausts. You can get an acro to replace the stock one. You do, with that in particular, end up with the stock collector, which is this huge kind of thing in here that I've removed on my bike. And yeah, I guess if I was putting a slip-on a bike like this, I'd really want to remove the collector for the weight savings, and obviously for getting the heat out of kind of that section there where it's near the shock. But that's going to be subjective, but I do think that the old exhaust is the nicer looking of the exhaust. And certainly with a scrambler, this isn't a particular scrambler style exhaust, but you know, that belly exhaust is even less of a scrambler style exhaust. Typically with the scramblers, you want the exhaust up here because the idea is, you know, you might be going across a river and all that kind of stuff, which obviously isn't going to be happening that much with a bike like this. But as far as the styling side of things, much bigger fan of a proper muffler rather than one of those little underbelly things, which while nicely kept away, it's still a very obvious exhaust under the bike. Talking about the front of the bike, as you can see here, we've got this dash, which the longer I've had the bike, the less I've liked it. Reflections are a bit of a problem on that dash. And while it does the job, technically speaking, on the new model, we're seeing a TFT dash, which is very nice to see. And then on top of that, we're also seeing a new set of switch blocks, which again, much more usable, a little bit more premium than the ones found on this bike, which is a nice little quality of life difference and finish quality difference. And then the TFT dash is what you use to control your cornering ABS, which can have a Supermoto mode. This doesn't have cornering ABS, it does have Supermoto mode. Your cornering traction control, which is a very nice feature for a new rider, and your ride modes, which are road and rain. Rain is essentially just a reduced power mode, so that if you're riding in really slippery conditions, you can dial down that power a little bit. I mean, you know, cool little feature. And certainly putting the bike at the head of the pack as far as kind of the inclusions that you're getting as far as an electronics package. And then because it's got the TFT, it's got mobile phone syncing, where you can get your turn-by-turn navigation. You can obviously see call and text details, I believe. And while I certainly wasn't trying to do that while I was over in Spain, I was busy enough making sure I stayed on the right side of the road. That does very much bring the new Svartpilen into where we'd expect it to be, which is at the very top of the 400cc segment as far as inclusion, specifications, and I'd say value as well. They have actually changed the levers, and they're just kind of a more premium lever, still fully adjustable. Different master cylinder as well. Again, it was like a little bit of a nicer looking master cylinder. The calipers have been changed, they're a different look caliper. The rack on the top of the tank is changed. It's a little bit smaller, more elegant. The tank itself is actually kind of extended a bit. It's a bit bulkier, and it holds 13 or 13.5 litres, and that's a lot more range than the little, I think this is an 8, maybe it's a 9.8. Anyway, there's quite a big boost in fuel capacity, which is going to get you further, which of course is nice. I'm not going to try and go over absolutely every single update because I just don't have the time, and I would guess neither do you, and it's probably not as important for you, but certainly the new bike is heavily revised. It's a much better machine in every way that matters, as I said, except for maybe the exhaust. And the wheels obviously being basically unchanged. We're still running the 17-inch wheels, spoked, tubed, Pirelli STR Rally tyres. No changes there. But in basically every other way, we are seeing some pretty significant improvements. Better handling, which I think ties into the better suspension feel and feedback as far as I found on the Svartpilen 401 2024 model. Much better on and off the brakes as well, with trail braking and just general brake use. A little bit more forgiving, but still nice and powerful. New look calipers as well. Much smoother, much nicer engine. Again, a quality of life improvement. The shift assist works significantly better on the new model. I did still very rarely have some problems with it. However, I find on this bike, it doesn't work all that reliably, or it's quite rough when it does work, where on the new model, again, hugely more refined, much nicer in how it worked, and really impressive. The electronics package, I guess from the perspective of a more experienced rider, something that I don't feel is necessary, but I think for newer riders and looking at the competition available, it's something that people more want included, because at the end of the day, with the bike price coming up a little bit, it makes a lot of sense to include that. And if you've got ride-by-wire, it also makes sense to have the electronic aids there, because that's one of the big advantages of using that system over kind of the traditional wired system with your EFI. And yeah, it's going to make it a much more competitive machine. It's going to be much more enticing to new riders. Would I buy one of these secondhand? I'd want to get a pretty good price on one of these to buy it secondhand compared to buying a new model. I think if you're looking at $1,000, even $1,500 difference between an old bike and the new 2024, I would say the 2024 is going to be the better buy as far as bike quality, the ride, the performance, just everything as an overall package. I also think what I've noticed on these older bikes, they don't hold their value quite as well as some of the competition for whatever reason. I've always found there are little areas on this bike where the finish quality isn't as good as I'd like it to be, and on the new bike they seem to have really put a lot of attention to detail into that, and those areas have all been cleaned up and look much better. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the new 2024 models hold their value a bit better than these older generation bikes, not only because the finish quality is just better generally, but obviously again they're the second gen bike, and as a result of that, with all the extra inclusions, they will hold their value better, while these will probably depreciate a little bit more in not having a lot of those inclusions. These bikes still have a more impressive loadout and level of specification, I would say, than much of the competition, particularly with those adjustable forks and the rebound on the rear shock, but the competition is catching up, and certainly the new models are much more decked out again, which is pretty cool to see. And KTM do seem to be in some ways competing largely with themselves in pushing their lambs and their beginner-centric options better and better, but can't really complain about that because they're just offering us better and better bikes. If you got any questions about the Svartpilen 401, whether it's the new 2024 model or my 2021, which is, basically first gen bike, let me know down below in the comments. As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.